And now they wrote this email again. Apparently they were impressed by
Good afternoon. Welcome to our lecture today. In today's lecture, Fasil Merawi and Jonathan Egid will speak about the linguistic politics of Ethiopian philosophy. Dr. Fasil Merawi is an assistant professor of philosophy and chairperson of the Department of Philosophy at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. His research interests include metaphysics, epistemology, critical theory, Ethiopian philosophy, and applied ethics. Recent publications, just from 2024, include articles like Philosophy, Education, and the Reconstruction of Subjectivity and Modernity in Africa, and Overcoming Eurocentrism, Exploring Ethiopian Modernity Through Entangled Histories and Coloniality. Dr. Jonathan Egid, lecturer in philosophy at SOAS, University of London, received his PhD in philosophy from King's College in 2024. He wrote a thesis on 17th century Ethiopian philosopher named Zara Yacob, and the question of whether or not he existed. One of his recent articles is entitled Hegel and the Hatata Zara Yacob, Africa and the Philosophy of History and the History of Philosophy. Together with Lea Cantor, both speakers edited the volume in search of Zara Yacob on the history, philosophy, and authorship of the Hatata Zara Yacob and the Hatata Walda Hewa, and well, they will pronounce this more properly than I can. I'm still learning. So while this figure is key in their joint work, today their focus and approach is more broadly. The purpose of the lecture is to examine the ways in which philosophical inquiry developed in the three primary languages of Ge'ez, Amharic, and English in Ethiopia. So I am looking very much forward to learning more, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for that generous introduction, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to be here, and I would like to begin by expressing my sincere thanks to the Center for Advanced Studies, Philosophizing in a Globalized World, Historical and Systematic Perspectives, for inviting me and Jonathan to be part of this important lecture, which is both timely and also interesting in its nature. So I am grateful for the opportunity to be here. And today with Jonathan, we are here to talk about the development of a field and a discourse within African philosophy, particularly one that deals with the development of Ethiopian philosophy and the contemporary interest and the ways in which different trends trying to characterize the development of this field, as well as the emergence of a linguistic politics that is threefold in its nature and is revolving around this language of Ge'ez, Amharic, and English seems to be developed. So regarding the outline of the presentation, essentially what I will do is I will be presenting part one, the linguistic situation in modern Ethiopian philosophy, whereas Jonathan specifically will deal with the second part, the Ge'ez cosmopolis, and there is also a joint discussion essentially dealing with debating philosophy in Ethiopia. So I would like to start out the discussion by giving a sort of a general overview of Ethiopian philosophy, the conduits within which it is being developed, the different trends that are emerging, and the manner in which we are able to situate the linguistic politics in such a context. So Ethiopian philosophy is a contested terrain, and in looking at the contemporary debate, one could say that it is situated within two major extremes. There is a universalist school of thought on one hand, which alleges that philosophy needs to be practiced without cultural qualifiers and specifications. And secondly, there is also an Africanist and comparative and an intercultural school of thought, which alleges that all forms of cognition, including philosophical inquiry, are essentially dictated by the cultural worldviews of a given culture, and that Ethiopian philosophy is not an exception as well. Again, in looking at the development of contemporary Ethiopian philosophy, one could also argue that there are four dominant trends that are emerging in the current context. One is the hermeneutic trend. Secondly, there is the intercultural trend. Thirdly, an indigenous. And fourthly, a trend that is more or less interested in the development of emancipatory discourse, and that could be seen as a critical theory trend, is also emerging as well. So briefly, this hermeneutic trend is interested in the articulation and the study of the Ethiopian text and the Ethiopian experience, whereas the intercultural trend is interested in developing these dialogical and polylogical encounters with an aim of showing that there are continuities between the local and the universal in general. Thirdly, there is an indigenous trend whose foundations were laid down by those thinkers like Claude Sumner. And most of the issues that we are going to discuss today, like the Hatatas of Zera Yaakov and Welde Hiyot, are essentially situated within such an indigenous trend. And fourthly, there is also a critical theory trend advanced by thinkers like Andreas Shete, Mesai Kabede, Ma'amira Menna Samai, and others that seeks to develop an approach that is both diagnostic and emancipatory in its nature, and is somehow modeled on the teachings of second generation critical theory in general. Furthermore, in looking at contemporary Ethiopian philosophy, particularly the ways in which it has been practiced within the academic context, one could argue that it has gone through two particular stages. The first one runs from the 1950s up to 2002, starting out from the time where general and common courses were introduced within the university setting, and where courses like general psychology, ethics, epistemology, and others were being given as philosophy common courses. And the second period essentially starts in the period of 2002 in the present moment, and this is where you have the reopening of the Department of Philosophy, as well as the emergence of a particular curriculum that is essentially modeled towards the introduction of the continental tradition. So from the very beginning, contemporary Ethiopian philosophy, one could argue, developed under state captivity, and looking at the genealogy of state and philosophy relations within the Ethiopian context actually shows that there were three particular stages and three state ideological influences that dictated the development of a philosophical culture of criticism within the Ethiopian context. So within the imperial period, it was the motto of liberal modernization that dictated the development of philosophical criticism. Particularly within the Derg period, It was a Marxist-Leninist regime, and as a result of that, courses like historical materialism and dialectical materialism were being given as common courses. And thirdly, starting from 1991, within the EPRDF period, where ethnic federalism was introduced, it was a logic of development and a sort of an instrumental philosophy of education that dictated the very development of philosophical exercise within the Ethiopian context. So taking this as a sort of a general introduction and a way of situating the debate, when we look at the linguistic landscape, one could see that Ethiopia's world of knowledge production developed in a sort of an entanglement with different conceptions of emancipatory discourse and different ways of conceptualizing the nature of modernity. And in such a context, one has a contestation of several discourses dealing, among other things, with a liberal, a Marxist, an indigenous, as well as a religiously inspired conceptions of modernization. And it is unique compared to most cases in the African context, because in the Ethiopian case, one sees the existence of both oral and written traditions, and this allows us to have these different materials for reflection in the development of a philosophical discourse. So within this linguistic landscape, there is a three-folded conception that is essentially dictating the way in which philosophical knowledge is being produced, disseminated, and developed within the Ethiopian context. And such a linguistic landscape is made up of the Ge'ez, Amharic, and the English language. Ge'ez constitutes the liturgical and the scholarly language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And among the three dominant ways that we conventionally utilize to understand Ethiopian philosophy, essentially it is through the usage of the Ge'ez language that the written sources as well as the sapiential sources of Ethiopian philosophy were initially introduced to the world of philosophy. So following the writings of the Canadian philosopher Claude Sumner, there are three particular sources of Ethiopian philosophy. He essentially argued that there is a written source dealing with the Hatatas of Zera Yaakov and Walde Hiyot. Secondly, there is what is known as the creatively adapted or the sapiential sources of philosophy dealing with particular works that are creatively appropriated into the Ethiopian context, like the life and the maxims of Skindis, the book of the wise philosophers, and the Physiologos, and so on. And thirdly, he also argues that Oromo wisdom and literature also constitutes another major facet and component of Ethiopian philosophy in general. So among these three dominant sources, the first two, that is the written sources and also the sapiential sources of Ethiopian philosophy were initially developed through the usage of such a language. Secondly, Amharic is the lingua franca of the Ethiopian state, and the way in which popular philosophy is being practiced within the Ethiopian context, whereas English is the language of academic institutions, and also the ways in which philosophical discourse is developed throughout Ethiopian universities. So taking this into account, the purpose of this lecture is to explore the linguistic politics of Ethiopian philosophy with an aim of demonstrating the manner in which language shapes the ways in which we engage with philosophical discourse, and also the ways in which we are able to reimagine the development of philosophical discourse in the Ethiopian context. So with that, I will now discuss the linguistic politics of philosophy in Ethiopia. Since Jonathan is going to zoom in into the role that is played by the Ge'ez language, I will particularly focus on English as well as the Amharic language. So when one looks at Amharic in the present political context, one could see that it is the language of popular philosophical practice And one could call such a practice a sort of a pop philosophy, where within magazines, the new forms of media, as well as the opening of several private schools, like the Zara Yacob School of Philosophy, you have the emergence of this discourse on philosophy, and it is being carried out through the usage of the Amharic language. So one of the unique roles that is being played by the Amharic language is found on the fact that it plays a role of mediating between ancient philosophical texts on one hand and modern everyday philosophical discussions on the other hand. And such a basic utility is grounded on the fact that essentially Amharic is able to mediate the world of Ge'ez and ancient religious texts on one hand, and the ways in which within the day-to-day life of the community such discussions are being carried out among the masses on the other hand. So this is, for instance, seen in the translations of the Hatatas and the book of the wise philosophers into Amharic. And within such a broader category that we could label as pop philosophy, one comes across the introduction of this discourse that is seen in the publication of all these works like the Tebab series that has an aim of introducing philosophical discourse, starting out with the ancient pre-Socratic period within the Ethiopian context. Again, you also have works like Rasen Filega or the quest for oneself and the quest for wisdom, ፍልስምና and ከፈላስፎች ዓለም. So essentially, all of these works are animated by the need to introduce philosophy to the masses, and there are both certain opportunities as well as traits that are involved in such a pop philosophical exercise. On one hand, such an exercise succeeded in introducing philosophy to the masses, but secondly, it didn't lead into the development of a mature philosophical discourse, since most of these works were produced by journalists and others who do not have a deeper understanding of philosophical discourse. And even though they managed to introduce such philosophical ideas to the masses, still it didn't culminate in the development of a philosophical discourse that is essentially able to reflect on existing societal predicaments. When one comes across the role that is played by English in the development of philosophical discourse, English constitutes the language of academic discourse. It is the language of higher education, and looking at the historical trajectory and the development of such an academic exercise within the Ethiopian context, mainly there are two periods within which it developed within. The first period starts out within the 1950s and runs up to 2002. And the second period starts with 2002, where the department was reopened, and it also constitutes the present moment as well. So when one looks at these two major periods, where through the usage of the English language, an institutionalized, an academic philosophical exercise developed within the Ethiopian context, there are several features that we are able to identify. The first period started out with the time of the imperial period, where philosophy was introduced in the academic context through the introduction of general courses and common courses, and one sees the influence of state ideology, different conceptions of the good, as well as the relation between the public and the religious sphere, essentially dictating the development of philosophical exercise in such a context. Secondly, the second period starts in 2002, and this is usually taken as a point of departure because during the last days of the Derg period, that is in 1989 or so, the philosophy department was closed, and it was reopened in 2002, and essentially abandoning the old curriculum that was oriented towards the mastery of the principles of Marxism and Leninism, a new curriculum that was founded on continental philosophy and also tries to host such a form of a creative relationship between continental, Eastern, African, and comparative traditions was introduced as well. But throughout both these periods, one could still see that there was always a rift between the academic and the popular practice of philosophy. And as a result of this, philosophy is still being conceived as a kind of an ivory tower practice, since the kind of philosophical discussions that are being carried out in the academia are totally divorced from the real issues that exist on the ground. And even though it is the Ge'ez, the Amharic and the English language that so far dictated the development of philosophical discourse, one could also look at the role, even though it is not significant, that is also played by regional languages as well. So Ethiopia is a nation that is characterized by linguistic diversity, where there are more than 80 ethnic groups and so on, and such languages are the vessels of distinct worldviews and oral traditions. But when you look at the ways in which philosophical works have been produced so far, one could say that only few works have been produced in regional language like the Orominya and the Tigrinya language, and even those fewer works that were produced so far are either introductory to logic textbooks and materials, or books that generally deal with philosophical concepts and are introductory analysis and so on. And as a result of that, there is a need to engage in what Kwasi Uredu calls a conceptual decolonization, and there is a need to incorporate the inputs of the local traditions in the development and the production of philosophical knowledge as well. Particularly in looking at the emerging trends within contemporary Ethiopian philosophy, one could say that there are four dominant trends. The first one is the hermeneutic trend. Secondly, there is the intercultural trend. Thirdly, there is an indigenous trend. And fourthly, there is also a critical theory trend as well. Briefly, the hermeneutic trend that finds expression in the ideas of philosophers like Danyacho Asafa and others has this interest in developing an interpretation and an analysis of the Ethiopian lived experience. Secondly, there is an intercultural and a comparative trend that finds expression in the ideas of thinkers like Bekkele Gutame and others that try to demonstrate the ways in which we are able to develop a dialogical exercise and develop a critique of centrism that finds expression within the dominant philosophical tradition. Thirdly, there is an indigenous trend as well. The foundations of such a trend were laid down by the Canadian philosopher Claude Sumner, who studied the different avenues within which Ethiopian philosophy finds expression in. And at the end of the day, he concluded that Ethiopian philosophy exists and that it has three basic modalities and ways through which it is expressed within. One is a written source. Secondly, there is the sapiential or the creatively adapted literature. And thirdly, there is also oral wisdom and literature that finds expression in the usage of proverbs, sayings, maxims, and oral traditions that are being transferred from one generation into the other. So, fourthly, there is also a critical theory trend being expressed in the ideas of thinkers like Andreas Shete, Masai Kabede, Ma'amra Nasamai, and others, and being animated by the need to develop a critical theory within the Ethiopian context. It tries to develop an analysis that is both diagnostic as well as emancipatory in its nature. But one thing that we could mention with regards to these 4 trends is the fact that most of these trends, with the exception of the indigenous trend, have not paid a sufficient attention to the study of language, and the kind of analysis that they have developed mostly is grounded on a kind of a historiography as well as a social ontology that is Eurocentric in its nature. And among these dominant 4 trends in contemporary Ethiopian philosophy, it is only the indigenous trend which partially tried to extract the role that is played by this different language in the development of philosophical discourse within the Ethiopian context. So in the current context, there is a difficulty of teaching philosophy in Amharic, where when you, for instance, teach courses like metaphysics, epistemology, and so on, it is increasingly difficult to internalize and translate concepts like being, absolute spirit, primordial matter, and so on into the local language. And there are 3 major consequences that essentially arise from such a difficulty. In some cases, you have these cases where the meaning is totally distorted, since one is not able to capture the meaning of the concept. For instance, we usually try to translate the concept of the primordial matter in the Amharic language using the Ge'ez lineage as ጥንተ ንብረት, but that doesn't quite capture the meaning of primordial matter. So it leads into a kind of a linguistic confusion. So distortion is the first difficulty that arises out of such an exercise. Secondly, there are also cases where there is a kind of a conceptual misalignment where we are not able to properly situate the concepts that are being discussed. In this regard, one concept that could be invoked is that of metaphysical being. Usually, this concept of metaphysical being, again relying on this Ge'ez origin, is translated as halio, but then again, this concept of halio does not properly capture the Heideggerian sense of metaphysical being as such. The third consequence, there are also cases where the meaning is also totally taken out of context and radically altered and distorted. And a case in point in this regard is this conventional conception of the hatatas, where we assume that the hatatas constitute a unique philosophical treatise because they are able to overcome the Cartesian substance dualism, dichotomy between the body and the mind. So one of the previous translators of the hatata wrongly translated the meaning of libona as the human heart rather than the mind. And based on that, this distorted account of the hatatas as a philosophical treatise that is able to introduce a new account of rationality, which situated the ability to think and the power of intelligence within the human heart rather than the human mind was introduced. So this is simply an error in translation, and mostly whenever an attempt is made to sort of contextualize these concepts, there are these 3 consequences that arise. Either the meaning is totally altered, there is conceptual misalignment, or there are also cases where the meaning has totally been distorted. As a result of this, there is currently a gap between the public and the academic practice of philosophy. Within the public, philosophy is seen as this ivory tower and an esoteric and enigmatic discipline that doesn't have a practical utility, something that is anti-social and anti-religious in its nature, and partly the development of a Marxist-Leninist discourse during the Derg period contributed to the development of such an exercise as well. So since I am running out of time, I will directly proceed into the section dealing with educational practices in philosophy. So the choices of language as a language of instruction in Ethiopian universities profoundly dictates the manner in which philosophy is being taught, the manner in which it is being understood, the ways in which it is being internalized, and the whole world of knowledge production in general. And students are being taught philosophy through the conceptual assumptions of European modernity. And this is creating a disjuncture between the language of instruction and the cultural linguistic backgrounds of the students. And in the current context, this has culminated in a kind of a linguistic distance that is being created. And Amharic is still being utilized as a way of popularizing philosophy to the masses. And one example of such an exercise is this private philosophy school that is known as the Zara Yaqub School of Philosophy. And it is a private school where various courses in philosophy like ethics, metaphysics, political philosophy, and others were being offered. And as I have said earlier, there are both opportunities and threats that emerge in such an exercise. The good thing is that this exercise of philosophy through the local language has a power of introducing philosophy to the masses, but at the same time, this pop exercise of philosophy that is not grounded on the development of a mature philosophical discourse is also emerging as well. So in the end, there is always a need to emphasize the development of an intercultural dialogue throughout the different discourses, ways of doing Ethiopian philosophy. And there is also a need to capitalize on Ethiopia's unique position within the African context, looking at the history of independence, the existence of oral and written traditions, the existence of this unique discourse of modernity that we call ዘመናዊ ስልጣኔ or modern civilization that sort of emerged in an entanglement with different constellations of modernity. There is a need to develop a discourse that particularly takes into account such a material for reflection. And in order to do that, there is a need to transcend both the universal and the Africanist perspectives. And the reason why Ethiopian philosophers failed to make any form of progress whatsoever, even though it started out within the 1950s, is the fact that it is still trapped within such poles. And one way of overcoming that is always to emphasize the intercultural dimension, to focus on translations, continuities, and the ways in which these different ways of doing Ethiopian philosophy are able to develop an articulation of the Ethiopian experience as well as the human condition in general. Thank you.
All right. So, first of all, can people hear me online as well? Sounds all okay? Excellent. Okay, so, as Fasil mentioned, the topic of the second part that I'm going to be talking about is going to be primarily focused on the one language you haven't heard quite so much about, namely Ge'ez. But I also want to talk a little bit, perhaps, about some of the ways in which this much older tradition overlaps with the 20th century material that Fasil was talking about. Indeed, a lot of this stuff has sort of presented itself to me as he was talking there about the interesting ways in which all four of the members of the sort of contemporary trends that Fasil was talking about are interested in exploring, engaging, reappropriating the earlier Ge'ez tradition in various different ways. So, first of all, I suppose most of you won't have heard of the Ge'ez language before. So Ge'ez is the classical language of Ethiopia. It's the language that most of the classical literature is written in. It's the language still today of the liturgy. If you go into an Ethiopian church, not only in Ethiopia, also in Eritrea, and also across the rest of the diaspora, this is the language you will hear. One of the analogies that you might hear for Ge'ez is that it's like the Latin of Ethiopia, or like the Sanskrit of Ethiopia. But if you were to draw the conclusion from it that it is somehow in a dead language, then an Ethiopian priest would get very angry and very upset with you because they would tell you that Ge'ez lives in the church, and it lives really in a way that no other language possibly does. And Ge'ez also, I think, lives as a language of philosophy and other kinds of literary production. I'm going to very briefly sort of list over some of the general characters. So if you haven't seen it before, this is what the text looks like. On the right, it is a Semitic language, therefore it's related quite closely to Hebrew and Arabic. You have lots of similar cognates and borrowings across the languages. It was spoken from around the sort of 3rd century BC until the 7th century AD, generally in northern Ethiopia, the regions of Tigray, some of Amhara and Eritrea. And Ge'ez literature is this incredibly long, impressive tradition of not only texts from this late ancient empire. Here we have the Azana Stele, which is sort of the Rosetta Stone of Ethiopia. You have text, the same set of text composed in Greek, which you have on the front side here, Ge'ez on the side, and the South Arabian languages on the other. And in Ge'ez, over the subsequent period where Ge'ez ceases to be a spoken language, but instead becomes the language only of the church and of literary production, we have a huge number of translations of religious texts, of original theological works, of chronicles of the Ethiopian emperors, medical and scientific writings, magic scrolls. The text we have on the right here is a kind of text that is worn as a kind of amulet for warding off evil spirits or demons, or invoking curses or blessings, and most controversially, philosophy. So, to say a little bit about what this tradition is, we need to sort of engage in one of the questions that I know you guys here think about a lot of the time, which is precisely how to sort of delimit the scope of what we count in philosophy. So there are two ways which we can think about doing this. Ways in which Claude Sumner, one of the great translators of Ge'ez philosophy, who Fasil's already mentioned, has done. There are two texts known as the Hatata, which are, by just about any definition of philosophy, even the strictest definition given by a historian of philosophy, working, say, in an Anglo-American university, would seem to count, right? They are written texts, first of all. They are discursive, argumentative texts which present very similar kinds of arguments to the arguments that you would find, say, in the text of early modern and medieval Ethiopian philosophers, European philosophers. For example, you are presented with a cosmological argument, the argument that if you seek to establish the existence of God, you must think about the causes of some particular action. So what is the cause of me drinking this water now? Well, there was my desire to drink water. There was the fact that it's a hot day and I was coming over here. And what was the cause for all of these things? What the cause of all of these things was my being born by my parents. What was the cause of my being born to my parents? Well, it was them being born to their parents, and so on and so forth, until we reach a point in this series of cause and effect in which there needs to be a stop to these causes, in which we have, let's think, an uncaused cause, an end to the infinite regress, and this, the argument goes, must be God. We have a theodicy, a defense of the justification of God, a solution of the problem of evil in these same texts. And generally we have the same kind of, broadly speaking, rationalism, if we want to use those terms, that we might find in contemporary thinkers. So this has been one of the works, along with its companion treatise of the Hatata wal Dahewat, which have generally been granted on almost any definition to straightforwardly be philosophy. We also have the Book of the Wise Philosophers. I'm going to mention that a little bit later. But much more interesting than just doing that, I think, for the purposes that people in the Centre for the Global, for global histories of philosophy, are broader definitions of some sort of texts that I'm going to look at now. Just very briefly, while we are talking about the Hatata still, we have on the left a very recent translation, just published with De Gruyter recently. This is by far the best translation, I think, of the philosophy of the Hatata. It's very easy to read, contains a significant essay at the beginning about the authorship of the text, and for a very different opinion on the authorship of the text, which we could maybe talk about in the Q&A afterwards, but I've spent the last 5 years talking about, so I'm probably going to breeze over now, is the volume which Fasil and I and our collaborator Lea Cantor have worked on, which contains another extremely long essay about the authorship of the text, which completely disagrees with the one over here. But to very briefly sort of further go into the meta-philosophical questions about the broad and narrow definition, this is something we were talking about yesterday with Chantal and Fasil and Monica at dinner. One way that I think is very useful to think about our choice, our meta-philosophical choice of a narrow or a broad definition of philosophy, is to ask the question that one of my favourite historians of philosophy, Justin E.H. Smith, from the University of Paris, has asked, is philosophy more like dance or ballet? Now, this is not just an excuse, although it is in part, to show you one of my favourite images in the history of philosophy, which is Socrates as a ballerina. But it's to ask the question, is philosophy like ballet, something which is a particular geographical tradition, something that has its origins, like ballet does, in Renaissance Italy, and which spreads to all corners of the world, spreads to the Bolshoi in Moscow and Mexico City and Australia, but by a process of dissemination. We have a particular point of origin from which this thing spreads. Now, this is the way I think that large-scale historians of philosophy have usually thought about this. If you're to read, say Bertrand Russell, probably the best known history of philosophy in the English-speaking world, philosophy begins with the Milesian miracle in Greece, and everywhere else it goes from Greece. Philosophy will spread with the Roman Empire, with the Arabic translation movement, both East and West. Eventually it will get up to this part of the world and my part of the world, but only by a process of dissemination. Okay? This is to say that the history of philosophy is the history of philosophia only. Whereas we might think of things quite differently on a wider definition as being more akin to dance. Now, dance is not the sort of thing that begins in one part of the world and spreads to all of the others by a process of dissemination. Dance is simply the sort of thing that almost all human societies do. I'm no great anthropologist, I won't pontificate about the nature of a human universal, but I've never heard of a human society that has no form of dance. And to understand philosophy as being something more similar to dance is to think about philosophy not as a particular kind of intellectual inquiry that exists as footnotes to Plato or Aristotle or whoever else, but the sort of thing that human beings with some time on their hands will do. The kind of more elaborate versions of reflection that anybody lying on their back and looking up at the stars will think, wow, those things are really, really big, and I'm really, really small. I wonder what the relation between the different scales of the universe is. Or on having an argument with other people in whichever community they live in, think, I wonder if there was a method of resolving disagreements with human beings quite generally. I wonder if there are principles to social organization. These kind of questions which will occur to just about all people at all times. And I think one of the difficulties that many of the philosophers that Fasil's interested in looking at is the difference between taking a broader versus a narrower understanding of what this philosophy is supposed to be, in cases where people perhaps have a narrower view on the basis of an interest in a particular set of European thinkers or a particular kind of ideologically driven philosophical outlook. There may be very particular reasons to take a narrower sort of view. If you believe that dialectical materialism has the keys to understanding not only the human past but the future and present as well, then there's all of this other stuff that we may consign to an anthropology department, but it's not really where the sort of core of the discipline is going to go. But what I want to do, I suppose, is to give a little bit of an overview about some of the other texts that are here. This is really just for people to have a look at some of the other sort of philosophical riches of the Goethe's language. These are a series of texts which I'm aiming to compile and conduct some translations of for a forthcoming edited volume on something provisionally entitled Philosophy in the Golden Age of Goethe's literature. We have texts like Ba'anta Hadu Konani, which is a kind of translation of Greek philosophical ideas from within the perspective of early Christianity. We start to get very interesting cases of philosophical translation and alteration of terms. Fasil spoke about Sumner's idea of the way in which Ethiopian literature never translates directly, but always creatively adapts the materials that it's working with. So one of these would be a translation of the Greek mikrokosmos or microcosm as neos alam. I think that the text also produces what I see as being one of the earliest transcendental arguments, most familiar from Kant and later philosophers in the history of philosophy as far as I know it. We have the Metzefer Mustir, which is a sort of, again, broadly speaking, philosophical work, more readily understood as a work of theological polemic. I'm going to go quickly through these because I don't want to spend too much time on this. The Ankatsa Amin, which is one of the works which is actively invoking the names of Greek philosophers in what is again a theological polemic. This is written against the leader of one of the Muslim lowland polities which invades Ethiopia in the 16th century. We have the Book of the Wise Philosophers, which is a nomologia or a collection of philosophical sayings, probably translated from Christian Arabic authors in the 16th century from a lost Greek original. And this is, I think, the best example of what Sumner is talking about when he talks about the creative adaptation of foreign ideas. So we have the names of a great many familiar Greek philosophers. So we have Socrates, obviously Socrates, we have Aflaton. In addition, presented as philosophers are biblical figures like David and Solomon. But the example that I want to give you concerns a character in the text known as, there's a character in the text known as Diogen, which is Diogenes. But the instance that I'm most interested in is an example of a story which we normally know concerns Diogenes. Namely the story where Diogenes, if you haven't heard of Diogenes the Cynic, he was a very strange man that lived in classical Athens, lived in a barrel, preferred the community of dogs to human beings. And when he was visited by the great Alexander the Great stepped in front of him and asked him if he wanted anything in the world, to which Diogenes replied, "Yes, please step out of my shade. I'm getting cold." And in the Ethiopian telling of this story, Diogenes has been replaced by Socrates. Alexander the Great has been replaced by an unnamed king. And the interaction between the two of them, when Alexander asks him if he wants anything in the world, is that Diogenes, or Socrates rather in this case, gives him a riddle in the form of the Kene poetry, which can also arguably constitute a major form of Goethe's philosophizing. It's a form of poetry which involves kind of double entendres and puns, multiplicities of meaning. And essentially, Socrates plays an elaborate joke on the king. He tells him something like, yes, but the one true life is in the life beyond. And the king goes off very happy, thinking that he's been told that he's wonderful by the philosopher, who sits there laughing to himself instead. So, we have the collections of these, and to very briefly give some of the sort of general overviews about the dynamics of Goethe's relative to other works of philosophy in the Ethiopian context. Through most of the period that the texts I've spoken about are written, we have a kind of diglossia, two languages being spoken at different levels of intellectual production. So Zer Jacob, for example, would have known Amharic, which he would have spoken at the court with other members of the sort of societal elite. He probably would have spoken a regional language like Tigrinya, having been born in the north, in Aksum. But all of the intellectual qualities were exchanged in Goethe's. So we might draw a parallel similar to Latin in early modern Europe, or perhaps to Sanskrit in India. And I think probably the analogy with Sanskrit is the better one, in the sense that when we have the period, in the early modern period, of vernacular languages emerging under the shadow of Latin, we have examples, for example, in my language, in English, of debates between two sides of people who wanted, on the one hand, to import Latin and Greek words into English. And on the other hand, people that wanted to establish new, original, Germanic, Anglo-Saxon sounding words. So you take a sentence in English like, every proposition is either an affirmation or a negation, right? Typical statement of logic. Now, all of those words are very Latinate. And there was one English scholar who decided that we needed some good English words. So instead of proposition, we have a shoe say. Instead of an affirmation, we have a yea say. And instead of a negation, we have a nay say. So instead of every affirmation, every proposition is either an affirmation or a negation, we have the sentence, every simple shoe say is either a yea say or a nay say. We have active debates and ideas about the way in which philosophical terminologies in these vernaculars are emerging from under the shadow of the classical language. And this is happening relatively early in English in the 16th century, in French, generally with people like Descartes, slightly earlier in some of the other southern languages. I'd be very interested to actually know really the point that this happens in German, because in the 18th century, well, it's remarkable, right? Because you still have Kant's inaugural dissertation in 1770 in Latin. So really, quite a bit later on, I suppose, Leibniz is already writing in. But we're going to the side there. Whereas in the dynamics I understand in India, it's a much later development from which Sanskrit has moved away as the primary vehicle of philosophical and literary expression, and the sort of intense weight of a much more powerfully still living religious tradition makes the emergence of philosophical terminology distinct from it rather difficult. I've slightly gone over the time already, haven't I? No? We all right? That one's a shameless plug, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I've actually already spoken about the translational model. So let's come back to something that Fasil was talking about. So Fasil mentioned a couple of thinkers, Mamire Menasame, who is somebody interested in critical theory. And one way in which he tries to do this, in my favorite one of his articles, is he tries to find the origins for a kind of critical theory relevant to an Ethiopian context, not simply by importing these foreign ideas, but by finding some kind of roots for them in earlier Ethiopian Goethe's texts. And the example that he suggests are the writings of a heretical sect known as the Dakika Estefanos. The Dakika Estefanos, there is in the aforementioned book that Fasil and I mentioned earlier, there's a wonderful essay on the Dakika Estefanos by Binyam Makonnen, one of Fasil's colleagues at Addis Ababa University. And one thing that he tries to do there is really something I think not too dissimilar from the English philosopher I was mentioning before, who wanted to find good, proper English words and not just borrow these Latin ones, right? He wanted to find ways not simply of sort of saying, well, we have this text by Adorno or Horkheimer or whoever else, and let's Ethiopianize it, let's simply apply these ideas, but to try and look for particular ways in which there are precedents for this in the Ethiopian tradition. And he finds that these authors have a critique of unbounded political authority, that there is a kind of rationalism in their ideas. The essay is unfortunately slightly undermined by him working from a translation done by Getachew Haile rather than the Goethe's original. But there are other examples as well. Andreas Esete, one person that Fasil mentioned earlier, looks back to the Hattata Zera Jacob for these original Ethiopian-inspired roots forwards to modernity. And really the reception of the Hattata has been full of people that try and look for ways in which indigenous resources are pointing their way towards a path to modernity that avoids the long, painful journey that many European countries and other parts of the world have endured on their way. In particular, there's a really interesting essay by a Russian scholar called Boris Turayev, the first thing ever really written about the philosophy of the Hattata Zera Jacob, who speaks about the way that Zera Jacob is wonderful, and he is not only the equal of Leibniz, Descartes, and all the rest of them, but is in fact superior somehow, because he avoids what he calls the desiccated atheism that these philosophies led them towards. It's bizarrely a kind of anticipation almost of Husserl in The Crisis, when he's talking about the fact that Descartes inevitably, by mathematizing and making an extended notion of nature, leads us towards this kind of, dry, terrible, atheistic rationalism. So, to conclude this quickly about what the study of Goethe's philosophy might look like today, it's really a study which is very much on the margins, not only of philosophical study in Ethiopia. As Fasil mentioned, there's a lively production of works in Amharic, of pop philosophy, if you like, something like that. There is, it's rather under threat from what Fasil's telling me at the minute. Academic philosophy is perhaps not what it used to be in Addis Ababa, but you still have a number of very interesting philosophers doing very important work in English. You have these initiatives like the Zedi Yacoob School of Philosophy where people are able to sort of take these academic discussions and use them in the local vernacular. But philosophy is really excluded, Goethe's language philosophy is not only excluded from these kinds of discourses by the fact that many people don't know the language after a long period of communist rule and the fact that church education is on the decline, but also by what seems to be a kind of inbuilt antagonism between religion and philosophy. Philosophy, in Amharic, Philosophena, is, I was told, I used to go out with an Ethiopian girl, and when she told her mother that I was a memher Philosophena, a teacher of philosophy, her mother laughed and thought it was hilarious because Philosophena, as she understood it, means a way of, if somebody is talking a lot of Philosophena, they're talking hot air, right? They're waffling on incessantly, the sort of person that likes to stroke their beard and stare out of windows and just won't stop talking, right? And there's this idea that if not being downright atheist, philosophy is somehow a European, perhaps a Protestant kind of innovation. It's something which is inimical to the religiosity, which is still really extremely important to Ethiopians in a way that doesn't really have comparison, I think, in any relevant European countries. So, the future directions, I think, for Goethe's philosophy has to really be translate, translate, translate. We have exactly one Ethiopian philosophical text translated into English. On the narrow definition, on a broader one, we have maybe 3, all translated by Claude Sumner with the Book of Wise Philosophers, the Zenes Gendes, and the like. And once these texts are translated, we need to be able to have discussions about them in the kinds of forum that are offered here, in the kinds of forum that Ethiopian studies has generally neglected. Ethiopian studies is a very old school philological discipline. It's quite interestingly very different from almost all of the studies of other African countries, in the studies of most Africanists are ethnographers or ethnologists, anthropologists in some way, focus on material culture, whereas Ethiopia was always considered to be kind of in Africa but not of it, to be studied through its Semitic, Christian, Middle Eastern, written cultures instead. So the kind of exploration that has to be given both by the Africanists, the philologists, the scholars, and the philosophers, on the other hand, is, I think, the most interesting way of putting it into dialogue with other philosophical traditions and other elements, linguistic traditions in Ethiopia. So, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please. Maybe you could come both in front, and thank you both for your presentations. I think, well, part of it was a wonderful introduction for us. Other parts were very advanced philosophical arguments about this situation. So I'm sure that there are some questions and comments from the audience. We always say students first, so please don't be shy. Yeah, I was very interested actually in this pop philosophy because, well, we sometimes, this exists in Germany to an extent, but I think also the academic philosophers just kind of ignore it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of potential in pop philosophy. So what must happen to pop philosophy that it can be like a potential interesting field of philosophizing?
Yeah, actually, my whole approach to pop philosophy is founded on Pauline Huntunji's critique of ethnophilosophy.
Yeah.
And I am worried that even though philosophical discourse needs to be popularized, even though the study of cultural worldviews, the study of the worldviews of a given community, the religious practices, the Kane tradition that Jonathan mentioned and so on, need to be articulated. But there is always a danger that is lurking in contemporary Ethiopian philosophy. And that is the danger of ethnophilosophy. Currently, even though philosophy is being popularized to the masses, and even though different works like the Ababa series that I have mentioned earlier on, that has this aim of developing an anthology of and the ideas of several thinkers, starting out with the ancient pre-Socratic tradition and other works in yoga. For some reason, certain works on Ayn Rand and others are being popularized to the masses, but there is always that danger of producing an ethnophilosophy. And again, this goes back into the earlier distinction between these broader and strict senses of philosophy and the ways in which philosophy needs to be practiced in the African context. I am one of those who argue that unless and otherwise we maintain this strict definition of philosophy, even though the pop practice can actually succeed in popularizing philosophy to the masses, but then again, we could also elevate each and every cultural worldview, each and every anthropological account, each and every cultural study into the status of philosophical discourse. And I think we need to take Huntunji seriously.
So you're more with ballet than with dance?
No.
So I think I completely disagree with Fasil on every possible point there. I think that pop philosophy is potentially, although the instantiations of it are often, for want of a better word, profoundly cringe, it's a really important and necessary step, and it's not something that necessarily needs to be based in a dumbing down or a sort of speaking to the lowest common denominator. It's normally a matter of being able to find a particular manner or a style of presenting philosophy that's engaging. I mean, I think things like, new media like podcasts are potentially very good for, I think, the history of philosophy without any gaps is a podcast series, which is not dumbed down at all, which is completely accessible to anybody who's, willing to sit down and really sort of have a little think and rewind and listen. But many of the classics of philosophy have the potential to be extremely popular. There's no reason that an interested and educated individual can't sit down with the Apology of Plato or the Symposium or Descartes' Meditations and really get something out of it. So it depends really what we mean by popularizing philosophy and how worried we are about the two falling into one another. But I do understand Fasil's sort of concern when it comes to that, because in one of the slides here, I was looking at the titles of it there on this one, and this is not high quality philosophy research, I would say. There's I was reading some of the names on there, but maybe we can talk about that later. This is a private thing.
Yeah,
Aristophanes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw two questions. Yeah.
Yes, I have seen many pictures from the religion space, so the commune and the farmer and George, St. George, and I don't find the connected together with it.
As in with the subject of the discussion?
Yes, the ground picture from these different pictures in this.
As in what connects the overall theme
Yes.
of the different images that were chosen.
Yeah.
Generally these are images that I use because they're created in the same time as most of the texts that I'm talking about. So I don't know, for example, this is not a work that necessarily has anything to do with the subject of the Hatata. Neither of those have any illustrations whatsoever, but it's a text which is being produced, which is part of the same sort of intellectual culture in 17th century Amhara and Begender. This is the point of illustration.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Actually, I have a lot of questions. I will reduce it to a few. Maybe about a pop philosophy, just a small remark. Here in Germany and in other European countries, since a while, there is a new orientation on public philosophy, which tries to bring philosophy more into the public again without having it or doing it in a way which is changing the quality. Yeah. And so far, I'm not quite sure if the term pop philosophy is not devaluating also a trend or an action which is trying to bring philosophy or make it accessible to a broader part of the population. Well, but anyway, my questions. For me, it was not clear, Fasil, why Ethiopia has been choosing English as the language of instruction at universities, because Ethiopia is maybe the only African country which was not colonized. Yeah, except these 4 years of Italian, I think 4 years of Italian occupation. It was never colonized, so why, at a certain point, Ethiopia decided to have a foreign language as the language of instruction at the universities? For Jonathan, my question is, thank you so much to bring up here titles of manuscripts which are not yet in the discussion, like On the One Judge, etc. And you said this is one of the earliest texts in Gesh, which can be taken as a philosophical text. So from which century are these texts? And to both of you, my last question. All what you described here now is based on philosophy in the frame of the Christian worldview. But there's an important part of the population in Ethiopia which is belonging to the Islam. And Islam has a very long tradition also already in Ethiopia. It is said that since 615 already, so before the Hajj, first Islamic people or Muslims were settling in Ethiopia. Is there any work done on Islamic philosophy in Ethiopia already?
Yeah, we have both questions, so...
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor Anke. Starting out with the question about pop philosophy, I'm not trying to reduce its value, but the way in which we have this conception of philosophy as something that is anti-social, anti-religious, a discipline that is an ivory tower practice, that is totally divorced from the lives of the people, it is totally being reinforced by the exercise of pop philosophy. And the reason why I emphasize that is that most of the works that we have seen here, like the Tabab series, Philosophy, and other introductory works, were animated by the need not to popularize philosophy to the masses, but to simply sell copies. And because of that, the strategy that these journalists that are mostly engaged in pop philosophy chose was to take some of these controversial ideas as a book cover, for instance. For instance, in that Tabab series, one of the works that was produced that generally deals with the introduction of philosophical wisdom, if you look at the volumes, these controversial issues like Nietzsche said, God is dead, Diogen lived here and there, and so on, were deliberately introduced. And because of that, the public has a negative conception of philosophy. And then again, there were also several attempts to introduce yoga, meditation, and so on, as a form of philosophy to the masses. But even those works, they also managed to further push the public from the world of philosophy. Because the way in which meditation, yoga, Eastern philosophy was introduced to the masses was like this esoteric discipline that is otherworldly, something that doesn't have daily values and so on. So it is true that public philosophy is playing a crucial role, but the way in which it was popularized, it was developed as an anti-social, anti-religious, anti-establishment discipline. And partly the development of Marxism-Leninism and the fact that we had this Marxist-Leninist regime, the Derg, it was in power, and philosophy at that time, even the whole curriculum was reduced into Marxism-Leninism. Even the common courses that were given at the time were like historical materialism, dialectical materialism, and so on. So going through that historical trajectory, the public still thinks that philosophy is something that is radical, that is anti-establishment, that is anti-religious, and so on. And the way in which we need to practice this public philosophy, we need to be careful about that. Not because it is not useful, but also because it leads into the very debasement of the nature of philosophy. And this is actually reminiscent of that whole debate between Derrida and Habermas, with Habermas maintaining that philosophy is not just a text, and Derrida reducing everything else into a text. And at the end of the day, if we open that room, then Kene will become philosophy, poetry will become philosophy, each and every other worldview, cultural beliefs will become philosophy. And I think we need to draw the line somewhere. Another issue regarding the introduction of English as this medium of instruction in the universities, it goes back into the period of Emperor Haile Selassie and the discourse on modernity that was introduced at that time. So it was pretty much oriented towards the attempt to introduce liberal modernization, instrumental rationality, in order to consolidate the power of the emperor. And since it was modeled towards Western modernity, the people at that time believed that we could actually maintain our own indigenous values while at the same time being able to learn from the instrumental rationality of the Western world. And English was seen as the tool through which this instrumental might of the West, introduced in science, technology, and so on, was introduced into the Ethiopian soil. Lastly, I do accept the view that the Islamic worldview was not incorporated. There is a need to carry out a study into that, but most of the studies that we have carried out are dependent on the works of Claude Sumner. He was the one that laid this foundation for the current study of Ethiopian philosophy, and within that foundation, those texts that are emphasized come from the Christian tradition. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, just another point on the question of Islamic sources as well. So generally the study of manuscript cultures in Ethiopia is divergent into the Christian and the Islamic. They're separate in all sorts of ways. You have Arabic on the one hand, Gutters on the other. You have paper manuscripts in the case of the Islamic world, parchment manuscripts in the case of the Christian world. The Christians generally lived higher up in the mountains, the Muslims generally in the lowlands. And Ethiopian manuscript cultures is overwhelmingly on the Christian cultures. In terms of people who work on Arabic manuscript cultures, so say Islamic philosophy in the Ethiopian world more than 100 years ago, there's a guy at the University of Copenhagen called Alessandro Gori who works on these things, but not really on philosophy, on Islamic manuscripts more generally. I tried to push him on whether there's any falsafa manuscripts or anything there. He says he doesn't know. He needs more students. So if any of you know Arabic or any of you want to get into the study of the Islamic world in East Africa, you should definitely go and get in touch with Mr. Alessandro Gori. And I mean, there was actually a piece in the last copy of Ethiopica which was about which a real stretch, a real broad definition of philosophy you could include, it was a zoological taxonomy. So you could think about this as an Aristotelian ontology of categorization of different types, but it would really be a stretch. There's lots of different words for giraffes and elephants and things like that. But it would be quite surprising if there was absolutely nothing, given the fact that you have the greatest centre of Islamic scholarship in East Africa, Harar, which is kind of on the edge of the Islamic world, and which was notable for its scholars. It's very close to centres of Islamic scholarship, in which we know we have philosophy in Yemen, and obviously the Hijaz with Mecca and Medina. So it would seem very plausible that there would be such things, and I've looked for it before, but I haven't found it. In terms of more contemporary Ethiopia, it strikes me that most of the figures that we've spoken about and stuff are either Orthodox Christians or secularized former ones, right? But that kind of just reflects the composition of elite levels of Ethiopian society in the period, I guess. There's a third group, which is potentially also not spoken about enough, which is that southern areas of Ethiopia have large practitioners of traditional religions. The Oromo traditional religion is a kind of a form of nature worship, would be fair to say, Wakafema.
Yeah.
And Sumner did some work on the oral traditions and the sapiential literature of the Oromo, but there's very little of that apart from Workina, who you also know. If I can finally actually get back to my little plug, a lot of these different languages are examined on this website here called Philosophizing In. It's also a podcast series. There's an interview with an absolutely wonderful philosopher in Amharic. His name is Fasil Merawi from Addis Ababa University. You see some of these topics touched on in the interview. And on the Oromo topics, there's one with another senior professor at Addis Ababa called Workina Kelbasa, and he focuses really on environmental ethics and interviewing local sages on these topics. So that was the Islamic question. The other question was...
From which age are these manuscripts?
So all of the Golden Age I could take from being the late 14th century to the start of the 17th century. No, late 15th to the early 17th century. So the Hatata lies just outside of one end, and the on the one judge is just kind of at the other end. I can send you something that actually has the breakdown of the different dates on it if it's helpful. But this is a kind of second period of the explosion of the production and translation of Goethe's manuscripts, which come very confusingly during the reign of the emperor Zeri Jakob, not the philosopher Zeri Jakob. It's even more confusing because the emperor Zeri Jakob wrote a number of theological treatises with very similar sounding names and stuff like that, the Matzafa Barhan, and that sort of thing. But if we really want to go to potentially the earliest examples of philosophy in Goethe's, then I think we can look to the Aksumite period. I mean, the translation of theological and biblical literature necessitates exactly the processes that I mentioned from the English guy, right? So Ralph Lever needs to come up with these new words to express good old-fashioned terms. And Goethe's scholars have to do exactly the same for translating Greek biblical terminology into Goethe's. So, for example, you have the term of mankind, right? Humanity in general. This is an essential term for Christian ethics. You can't have a universalist ethics unless you know who this ranges over. And the term that they use to translate it is the Agula Emheo. So it's something like the offspring of life. This has got nothing to do with the original Greek term. You have something like the Theotokos, which is, the mother of God. And they translate that very directly instead as the Waldita Amlak, as the mother of God. So all of these choices that are made about the production of a philosophical vocabulary are happening very early on. I can think about these people as being philosophers in a broader sense, as well as translations like Sumner's translation that he's got of the Physalogos, which is really a work of nature mysticism. It says, the pelican is a symbol of Christ because it feeds itself with the blood of its, children with its blood. And number one, that's not how pelicans work. And number two, it's only philosophy in a very general sense, but if we're taking that broad one, then we can set back the origins of philosophy in Goethe's by a nice clean 1,000 years.
Yeah, thank you very much for these exhaustive answers. Now we have
Thank you very much. Concerning the pop philosophy, the image of Nietzsche of that book, I know that from a play or a television movie from Nietzsche is also popularizing as a pop movie on Nietzsche. But my question goes back to the, Fasil, in a moment of your presentation, you talked about this hermeneutic approach. And so what I had in mind was rather a form of text hermeneutic, so based on this written text and tradition. But you had also this interesting term of lived experience. And my question is about exactly the lived experience. Is it about the, which kind of lived experience is a form of, let's say, original historical experience to be exposed through the analysis of the written text, or the lived experience is the lived experience of the subjects, of the human beings nowadays in the concrete society of yours? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, actually the kind of experience, the text that thinkers like Dañacho Asafa and others who currently belong into the hermeneutic trend that Ethiopian philosophy has been developed through are trying to articulate is the nature of subjectivity. And if you look at their intellectual origins, all of these thinkers went to Western universities where the continental tradition was dominant. And the conceptual foundations of these thinkers are grounded, for instance, in Martin Heidegger's Daseinanalytik, Husserl's phenomenology, Sartre's analysis of freedom, Gadamer's conception of fusion of horizons, and so on. So rather than the study of texts, it is the way in which the Ethiopian conception of the human subject, the principle of individuation, has developed, and also the ways in which it morphs into the current context and its relations with discourses of modernity, ethnic federalism, contemporary predicaments, and so on, that this trend is trying to study. So it is not more of a text, but the study of the lived experience and subjects that have been marginalized, dehumanized among successive regimes. That is what is being studied.
Very small point to add maybe is just that hermeneutics is a very good fit with other elements of traditional Ethiopian culture. So the Kene poems that you come up with are discussed at length afterwards. And it's really the discussion of the poems more than anything else, and the teasing out of the various different formalized hermeneutics in which you have to look at the text. You have the wax and gold, in which you have a surface meaning and a golden hidden meaning underneath. And it's the hermeneutic act that has to sort of melt away this waxy layer to reveal the real gold underneath. And the discussion is really open-ended and ongoing, because nobody will ever admit to you the meaning of a Kene that they've come up with, which show that they haven't done a very good job. So I think that it emerges quite naturally out of other aspects of the tradition as well.
Yeah, there's one more question.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I wanted to go back to the Ge'ez manuscripts that are, if you want, pre-modern or extra-modern. In the process of translation between Greek and Ge'ez, for example, do you see there anything like creatively, any creative process happening between these languages, that if you translate it into Ge'ez, that there's the philosophy of the Orthodox Christian Church is somehow changing because of this translation process? Does it neatly fit into the prescribed discourse, or is there something happening that is somehow bringing it on a different lane, so that thinking somehow changes through the translation process? Is there anything that you see already in the manuscripts? I don't know how much the research has advanced there, but
there's really very little. I mean, on the philosophical stuff specifically, there's really very little research, but the stuff that there is, namely initially from Claude Sumner, is really revealing. So in the text of the Book of the Wise Philosophers, you have many of these figures of classical Greek philosophers. But they're not saying the kinds of things that you'd expect them to say. So Plato's not espousing the theory of forms, or the doctrine of ammonoisis, or the idea of the ideal city with three different groups and all the rest of it. Instead, Plato has essentially become an orthodox monk. In particular, Plato becomes in the book of the wise philosopher St. Jerome. There's a passage where Plato is charming a lion by removing a rotten tooth, which is very much like removing the thorn from the paw. So the figure of the philosopher seems to have been kind of, as the figure of the philosopher is in many different places across the world, associated not so much with its contemporary social role, at least in my country, in this country, as far as I understand, largely of being something of an academic mandarin, functionary of the government who fills particular roles and gets particular research grants and the like, or like the philosopher as a scientist, as they might have been in early modern Europe, but something much more like the philosopher as a sage, as a person who has a special kind of access and relation to the divine. So philosophers are very closely associated in these texts with acts of asceticism, with self-denial and resignation, which is, I think, quite possibly a reason by the time you get to contemporary Amharic translations of Eastern spirituality, that's the lens through which we have to see it, right? It's not the kind of, westernized yoga and meditation, which is improve your productivity by doing some breathing exercises. It is remove yourself from the shackles of the world with these breathing exercises sort of thing. So that would be one way of doing it, but in terms of translations into Goethes that actually reveal substantive changes in the philosophical ideas, there's just not really enough on it yet. I wish I had a better answer.
Yeah, there's room for one last question.
Yeah, I guess.
No, there's another answer.
Yeah,
so please.
I guess what I would like to add is centrally, there are two issues that we need to raise. One, what is a philosophical text after all? And can these texts constitute a material for philosophical reflection? And again, going back into that famous Habermas-Derrida debate, Habermas explicitly argues that the development of philosophical discourse requires a propositional language, whereas art and literature are grounded on a poetic and a derivative form of language. So the danger that is found in elevating the Kene tradition, this Goethe tradition, into the status of a philosophical discourse is to what extent are they able to host a philosophical form of criticism, and are they capable of hosting such a criticism in the first place? That is one issue. Secondly, there is also the danger of translation and the manner in which the concepts are distorted. There is a whole literature, for instance, on the Hatatas of Zara Yaakov and Walde Heyot, arguing that they somehow introduced a new philosophical canon into the philosophical tradition. The idea that the power of intelligence is found within the human heart rather than within the human mind. And there are certain scholars who argue that that is a problem that arose within translation. And that just like the Western mind, this idea of thinking within the Ethiopian subject is found within the human mind rather than the human heart. So a simple error in translation, in translating that word, Libbona, into the human heart rather than the human mind, led into the development of this whole discourse. Even a famous book arguing that Zara Yaakov somehow transcended the Cartesian system of substance dualism. So this idea of translation comes with its own difficulties.
Yes, a small question, still possible.
What is this?
That's for the online audience.
Oh, okay. Well, given that there's not much time left, I will just then make it a comment and then we can have the questions after. It seems to me that, especially you, Fasil, have anchored the discussion on this problem that you sort of skirt around, which is the problem of universalism and particularism. And you started saying it in the beginning of the discussion. And it seems that at some point, if you had settled it earlier, then the problems that come after wouldn't. For example, with your problem of the primordial being and how to translate that, and how those there's a difficulty with that also. So even the example with the heart-mind example, which I think if you settle the question of universalism, but you did say that you are particularly Hontonjan. Maybe if you take a particularly Hontonjan view from earlier on, then we know that you and I are enemies intellectually, then we wouldn't run into the problems that you spoke about. But I would expand on that, but I can't, given that you said there's not much time left, but I'll make sure to talk to you about this after.
Yeah. I would simply answer by saying I have this, I just published this recent article on Aeon on this particular question. Should Ethiopian philosophy be universalist or Africanist?
Africanist.
And my answer was somehow to opt for the Huntongian perspective, while at the same time showing how the Africanist perspective loses sight of our common humanity, whereas the universalist perspective is so obsessed with the ideas of the greatest philosopher that it loses sight of our Africanness.
Thank you very much. Surely we will continue the debate right afterwards and also tomorrow. Thanks again for your brilliant presentations.